Hey there, everybody. It's Fox 35 reporter Mike Magnoli. The photographs that you're now looking at, Richard Garriott. He is a space tourist, trained for about 8 months back in 2008 to go up to the International Space Station on a Russian spacecraft, and I am interviewing him about the exciting things that are happening in the space tourism industry. A company named Bigelow has just announced a collaboration with SpaceX. They've reserved 4 launches. Each launch will have 4 seats apiece, and you can go up to the International Space Station for a whopping $52 million. Then once you get there, it's $35,000 a night, and you have to stay for at least a month. So here's me and Richard talking.
So the headline, this kind of sets the backdrop of, is that Bigelow has announced that it's going to be partnering with SpaceX to put people on their crew caps, take them to the space station. And for context, I kind of want to get a sense of, is Bigelow like a Space Adventures competitor? Are they in the same market as you?
Well, I would say only tangentially, in the sense of Bigelow really makes the habitats that anyone going up to the space station would like to have access to. The ISS only has very minimal crew quarters, and so any additional space to work or play or live would be highly desirable. That's kind of Bigelow's part of the mix. SpaceX, of course, is in the business of launching material and people now coming up to space in general, but also to the ISS. And Space Adventures, is in the business of finding customers who want to go and is relatively agnostic as to what vehicles they fly on. We've always used the Russian Soyuz in the past. We also have agreements with Boeing for their CST-100, and obviously we'd be happy for people to go with SpaceX and Bigelow as well. So I would say yes, and to some degree these companies are all competing, but in a very real way they're all collaborating as well.
You have a list of people who want to do this, and I don't know if there's confidentiality issues, but if you could tell me some of the people or what types of people want to do this.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about thinking about who are the kinds of people who can afford it and who will choose to go to space, the list is actually longer than you might imagine. I mean, if you ask anyone on Earth, regardless of their wealth or profession, whether they would like, if they could, to live and work in space for at least some time in their life, 80% of all people say yes. And that, of course, means that 80% of the people who could not afford to at this stage would say yes. But also that means 80% of the people who can afford to would say yes. And so it turns out that the list of extremely wealthy people who would like to spend time in space is actually quite long. So getting a list of people who are qualified to go and want to go is actually not the hard part. The hard part today at these high prices is that most of these very wealthy captains of industry who can afford to go and would like to go also have difficulty planning that trip because at least so far the trip has required a lot of training. It of course includes some inherent risks. And so anytime those people think about, anytime a slot becomes available to fly, we go down that list and say, hey, would you like, your slot is available, are you ready to go? As often as not, it's not a good time for them because they sort of have to retire out of their business that they're the captain of. If it's a public company, their stock price might, go down because of the lack of focus or potential risk to the, principles of the company. And so actually finding the right time to go is a much harder problem than finding people who want to go. And so, I would say at any time, there's half a dozen people actively, on the list pursuing a flight, but then matching them up with the sporadic rhythm of seat availability of the past has been tricky. The good news now is that, with the new vehicles that are being built by both Boeing and SpaceX, that the opportunities are now going to become much more on a regular cadence. That regular cadence should also, over time, reduce the price. A reduction in price will actually expand the marketplace, as you might imagine. And we're looking at a time frame where the space shuttle was peak cost and peak danger, $100 million a seat and 1 out of 70 chance of death. And the Soyuz and SpaceX are already down to some more modest tens of millions. But with the full reusability that they're targeting, those prices might come down to about 1 million. 1 or 2 million. And with things like Starship that SpaceX is pursuing, they believe they can get it down into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when you go from hundreds of millions to hundreds of thousands, that's 3 orders of magnitude of price reduction. And so whatever you thought was, whatever's difficult to do at 3 orders of magnitude too high a cost, it's dramatically easier and will become more prevalent as that price drops.
Are there any Hollywood types or like household names even of industry where if you said this person wants to go, my viewer would be like, oh yeah, I know who that is.
I would say half of the people on the list, the 6 active people that I know that are talking about or considering, picking up a slot in there. About half of them are people that would be, known names, and the other half are, quieter or less publicly exposed individuals by all means. But all these people keep their names, off of public record to a large degree because it would actually impact their lives. They would, again, if they owned public stock or were the captain of some company, that would interfere with that company's forward progress. And so for myself and even others, I wasn't as worried about it as many are, but up until you have not only signed up for your flight and start your training, up until you've literally start flying over to, in my case, Russia to begin training, even the medical tests I did were all done under a pseudonym. And that way, if there was some reason that my flight was delayed or I couldn't qualify medically for the flight, my name would not be in the public yet. And so therefore, there wouldn't be any interference with whatever I might be doing in business.
How long did you have to train for? And is that training criteria still the case for somebody who wants to do this?
Well, the training has reduced over time. The time that I flew, I trained for almost a full year in Russia. And then even a year before that, I was doing all my medical pre-qualification work as well. So it was really a 2-year process to go from committing to the flight to flying. But that has slowly reduced the training time now to go on the Soyuz, for which there is no passenger seat. The Soyuz, you are a fully trained, qualified, and operational astronaut when you fly on Soyuz. The newer vehicles that hold more passengers have true passenger seats where you are not within reach even of any of the controls. That being said, there's still really important safety training that must go on, and equipment utilization training and emergency procedures that have to be trained. And so that still requires a month or 2 of training, even at a minimum. If you're going up to the space station, I would say maybe 3 months, 2 or 3 months is sort of the floor. Now there will be other vehicles and other environments where that training will become even more and more commonplace or easier to tackle even in shorter time. But I would say today 3 months is likely the minimum that I would recommend that people fly with.
So if I went to my boss and I said, well, I want to go to space as a journalist, their answer to me would be, Mike, we can't lose you for that long because what if there's breaking news? Who's going to go?
Well, there'll be plenty of breaking news up in space. I promise you, for the a nominal trip to orbit right now is somewhere between 2 weeks and maybe a month at the longest. I'm sure they could do without any of us for that period of time, and there would be a lot of wonderful reporting while you're on orbit. And in fact, when people think about what is broadly called as space tourism, and I actually don't think I'm a space tourist. I actually went as a private astronaut. I did a lot of commercial work and fundamental research, hoping to find ways to not only offset the high ticket price that I paid, but also future businesses to pay for future flights. That's sort of that's the business I'm in, is opening up space. And the good news, as this price drops, if you're thinking like, wow, I can't afford that, even if it's definitely can't afford 100 million, probably couldn't afford 10 million, probably couldn't even afford 1 million, and even 200,000 would be a big stretch. The good news is that as that price comes down, for example, a journalist can begin to make a better case, and they can say, look, for 100 grand or 200 grand, if I'm the first journalist to go up there and really do a detailed program of hour by hour reporting about what it's like to be in space, what it's like to live, what all the experiments are happening, what I see, how seeing the Earth from space impacts me, and how it should change your own perspective and also the perspective of others on Earth, that would be a great story, and it's probably worth a few $100,000. And so I actually think the majority of people who are going to go in this next decade are not going to be self-funded billionaire tourists. It's the explosion is going to happen as people begin to imagine, I'm an entrepreneur. I can imagine raising money to build a widget, to do medical research, to grow, make perfectly round ball bearings because of the microgravity, to grow crystals of fiber optics that are extremely pure, again because of the environment that you're in. Those entrepreneurs, as this price comes down, are going to need people to fly and turn those wrenches and write those reports and send the data down. And that's how the majority of us are going to fly, is by thinking of something really important and valuable to do in space.
What was your favorite activity, the thing that you did that you liked the best up there?
Well, floating in microgravity is literally a giddy feeling the whole time you're there. I mean, like going over the top of a roller coaster where you get the lightness in your stomach and kind of tickles you and you almost feel like laughing. That's just stays that way the whole time. And the view out the window is spectacular. It feels like just looking out the window feels like a fire hose of information about the grand scale systems of the Earth just pouring into your mind, like weather and erosion by wind and water, and how the tectonic plates are moving, and the impact of humanity with roads and dams and pollution all over the Earth. I mean, it's profound to look out the window. But just playing with the difference in the laws of physics is the thing that I think captivates you the most. As simple as creating a droplet of water out in front of you to try to drink, or similarly playing with your food as it begins to float away and you have to figure out a way to get it back without scattering it even worse. And just all these little life moments to how different it is from being in a gravity environment. Those are the simple joys of just being present in space.
So you've done it once. Would you do it again, or do you feel like, okay, I've kind of checked that box? What's next?
Oh, I absolutely plan to go back. In fact, my wife knows I'm devoted to going back. To her only request to me, since we now have children, is to wait for the children to get a little older, just in case something bad happens. So the kids will have been old enough to remember me well. But my kids are about old enough for that now. So as I'm watching the price drop, I'm already looking for when is going to be my next time to fly.
You're a trip, man. Oh my goodness. You going to the bathroom in space. You put up a picture about what a process it is. What would your warning be to a would-be space tourist about that part of life?
Well, almost every aspect of life in space is as good or better than life on Earth, I would argue, except two things. One is the food's not so good. It's literally military rations that have a 1-year shelf life, all packed in a storage locker that you unpack at room temperature and eat. It's not bad, but it's just it's not fine dining by any means. But by far the bottom of the line is personal hygiene. There's really no running water, no sink, no flushing toilet. Bathing is with wet towels. You just rub all over your face and hands and body. And going to the bathroom is, in fact, a real challenge. If you've ever watched the movie 2001 and seen the guy pull out the instructions to the space toilet, that's true in the sense of, there's already a list of 30 or 40 steps just to turn on, utilize, and turn off the toilets. But even the process of taking things that are coming out of your body and making sure they go into the toilet when there's no gravity is a challenge. The only thing that helps you is airflow. And so for urinating in space, that's actually no problem. You basically pee into a funnel attached to a vacuum cleaner, and that's largely a easy and successful process. However, solid waste disposal is much harder. Solid waste has a habit of sticking to yourself versus being pulled by the subtle airflow into the container in which you're hoping to deposit it. And so you have to go through a lot of maneuvers to shake your body to get things to separate from you, and then make sure that the bags don't get blocked with what has now been deposited in the bags. And it is literally a physically arduous, geometrically complex, hard-working. By the time I got out of the bathrooms, I was always sweating up a storm just because of how much work I had to do to, keep everything situated properly. But what's interesting is there has been millions of dollars spent on the development of space toilets, and I would argue there has never been a good one made yet. And so, there's an entrepreneurial idea. A way to get yourself into space is build, test, and you need to test yourself a newfangled toilet for space. And that's, there's one invention that will get yourself a ride to space.
You can't take a shower in space, right? Like after you go through this whole process, it's not like you can just like go somewhere and like hose off, right?
No, in fact, the only shower that has ever been in space was taken aboard Skylab, when my father flew on Skylab, and it was a cylindrical curtain. They had a small, like 1 or 2 liters of water they were allowed to use for a shower on a handheld sprayer. But then after you sprayed it on yourself and maybe a little soap, you then had another hose, which was a vacuum cleaner to suck that water off of you. And so everybody that did it said on the one hand, it kind of was, felt interesting to be in something that was geometrically like a shower, but the soap on, soap off process was so labor intensive that most of them abandoned it and went back to the wet washcloth.
Right. Okay, you open up space travel for tourism, and I'm not gonna like miss an opportunity to ask you this question because it is really a pleasure to be able to interview you. So I'm not going to miss this opportunity to ask you this question because I know a lot of people probably ask you about it, and a lot of viewers at home want to know. This could take the Mile High Club like to a whole new level, right?
Oh yeah.
I'm sure there are people all over the world that want to know about that. So I guess my question is, like, if someone wants to become a customer of Space Adventures, that's the ultimate adventure, right? Like, what do you tell them? Can the space station like even accommodate that? Like, is there an area, or will there be? What do we know about that?
Well, first of all, think of by the way, interestingly, like one of the first questions I got asked when I got back down to the ground by some of my family's friends was, would sex be possible in space? And, what are the ramifications of that? And so first of all, it would be possible. You would have, gravity actually assists couples staying together, which would have to be managed. But that could easily be done. I mean, there probably be some interesting adventures you might be able to have in that sense. The space station, even as it is, even though I've mentioned that there's not really very good passenger accommodations, there's only 4, last I remembered, small little coffin-sized rooms for individuals, or there wouldn't be a couple's cabin at this point. But on the other hand, the space station is quite large. In fact, it's about a dozen school buses docked with each other. And so, I would go off to work or sleep in the space station and often never see anybody else unless I went back to the galley and went back through some of the common core areas. So there would be areas, large spaces already that would be private, where you'd have a sense of privacy. But especially with the new modules going up, I'm sure that there will be opportunities like that. And by the way, even though officially no one has ever had sex in space, there have been married couples who have flown together. And at least I am, suspicious that, if I had that opportunity, I think it would be hard to pass up.
NASA never plays ball. You ask them, and they don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll keep asking them.
Yeah, exactly. But some of the folks that I know are considering flights here in the near future are also married couples, and so again, that issue will come up now. But the fun aspect of adult interactions in space belies a second level question, though, which is, could you procreate in space, and could you bring a baby to term, for example, in space? And the answer to that question is a resounding no. It actually turns out that cell division, which we all do all the time, but especially as an embryo, of course, that's the way you grow into existence. Cell division, the presence of a vector of gravity actually is important to cellular function. And so there have been a lot of experiments done where embryo development, fruit flies, chicken eggs, all kinds of things have been, fish, that sort of thing. And it turns out there are real challenges to biology for being in zero gravity. So you actually would not want to get pregnant in space. So you'd want to play safe.
Huh. Right. That's interesting. It's fascinating.
But that also that creates an interesting challenge as humans think about becoming a a spacefaring nation or spacefaring civilization. Thinking about these issues of survival in the high radiation environment and long-term survival and procreation in a microgravity environment actually become real issues. So we could not, for example, send a multi-generational spaceship to Alpha Centauri to look for life if there was no replacement for gravity or some other countermeasure to this problem.
Right. How does this industry look to think about the potential for an accident? And to set this question up a little bit more, you think about commercial air travel and how many people are flying on planes all the time, and they say you're safer in the plane than you are in the car. Well, space tourism has not had, because it's still so new, there hasn't been an accident where a space tourist has been lost, right? And invariably, that's going to happen. Or am I mistaken? Do you all just not even think about that or factor that in?
No, in fact, I think it is true that it is inevitable that a private citizen flying in space will be lost at some point between now and probably not that distant future. The good news is that while the space shuttle was peak cost and peak danger with about a 1 out of 70 chance of death that was both predicted and in fact is how it happened, space capsules are far, far safer. And in fact, other than when I was very young in the very birth of the space age, there has been no deaths in a launched or reentering capsule in the history of space travel. And the reason why capsules are so much safer is because they have an escape tower, which the shuttle failed to have. If a rocket has a statistic of, say, maybe being 1 out of 100 chance of failing, on the shuttle, that 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 70 chance meant everybody died. In a capsule, if you have an escape tower, that escape tower is also probably at least as safe as 1 out of 100. And if you add that, multiply it together, that means it's only about a 1 out of 10,000 chance that both the launch system and the escape tower would fail. And in fact, it's probably much safer than that. And so capsules are already fundamentally, dramatically safer. But that still doesn't mean they're as safe as air flight travel by any remote stretch. The good news, however, is that the theory and reality that is playing out about reusable spacecraft is that these vehicles are becoming much safer, much more quickly. If you think about that, and you contrast that to cars, spacecraft used to be you build one, you fly it on its maiden voyage, it either works or doesn't, and then either way you destroy it and build another.
You don't repeat. In the olden days, you never repeated because you didn't want to put it under that amount of strain again. Right?
Well, you couldn't. It was actually not recovered in a way you could. It literally didn't have a way to get to the ground without destroying itself. The parts fell to the ground literally. And if you think about driving a car, if every time you filled up a car, you buy a car on the lot, you fill it up with 1 tank of gas, you drive it till it runs out of gas, and then when it's out, you crush the car and buy a new one. First, it'd be phenomenally expensive, so you wouldn't drive cars much. And cars wouldn't be nearly as safe because you'd never really put enough miles on any one of them to really know why certain parts fail in what order. And so this reusability is going to drive a level of safety that is going to quickly, maybe not completely catch up to airplanes because it's under, substantially more stresses and the edge of engineering performance compared to an airplane these days, but get way better than they are now, very, very quickly.
I'm just thinking about the Concorde, for example, amazing airplane that could do an amazing thing, and we don't have it anymore. We don't have it anymore because of the accidents that made headlines, but if you look at its service record, it's really an incredible piece of machinery.
That's true, but also don't forget when
they lost confidence in it. They lost confidence in it.
But what they lost confidence in was that one vehicle. The Concorde itself, due to those accidents, was retired, but people still fly airplanes. And yes, it's true there's no longer, or at least not at the moment, there is not an operational supersonic passenger carrying airplane. And that's just due to economics. And those economics may be changing again here in the future. Or actually, we may be using suborbital vehicles to travel to the other side of the Earth in under an hour. And so, these things are coming. They will come back as economics drive it. But yes, the entire industry talks about safety all the time. Even the FAA has to weigh in and go, what is the public benefit versus the public risk? And I think the FAA has done a really great job of modeling it by saying, look, what you really don't want to happen is fly a rocket over a city where parts of that rocket fall down and kill unsuspecting bystanders who did not agree to take this risk. On the other hand, as you open up a new industry, it is reasonable to let well-informed people who really do understand that I'm getting in an experimental vehicle or I'm helping open up this industry and I'm an adult and I truly understand the risks, for those people to sign up and take that risk on themselves is reasonable. And that's really the only way we're going to open up frontiers like this. And the FAA sees it that way. That's the way the rules are largely structured. And I think that's going to allow this to proceed. And if there is an accident, which there will be, that will be a setback for the industry. It'll be a giant setback for whoever the manufacturer of that vehicle is. But the industry will continue.
What laws govern space? When you go to the International Space Station, what's the law of the land, or is there not one?
Well, it's complex. It's sort of like the laws of the sea. In fact, laws of the sea are a good metaphor, where there are certain, kind of United Nations agreements about, making sure that people don't launch and hit each other accidentally in space and give each other room when they're playing. But once you're on orbit, it is the commander of that vehicle that makes the rules. And so if you think about, who makes the laws about, everything from theft and murder to property ownership. Once you're on orbit, it's the captain of the ship that makes the rules. In fact, that we had to use that some during my own flight. I had some folks on the ground try to restrict my activities in space, and I had to have the captain overrule the ground initiatives for me to continue some of my work. And so, that's already in play right now on the International Space Station.
Interesting. Okay, I'm coming up on the half-hour mark, so this is the lightning round. This is my winding down here.
Great.
You were kind of born into this in a sense that you had this curiosity because of your family and because of your personal history, right? I mean, this is something that you've thought about since you were.
Absolutely, but it's important to know, that I grew up in a neighborhood of all astronauts. All of my playmates were the children of other astronauts, and almost none of them, outside of myself, chose to pursue space. And for me, when I was very young, space just sort of seemed like the manifest destiny of everyone that I knew. Not only all the parents, but I just assumed when we all got older, we'd all go. Whatever it is we did other than space, we'd also go to space. And it was when I was about 13 years old, there was one of the NASA doctors who told me that because I needed glasses, I was no longer eligible to be an astronaut. And I was crushed. I actually thought, here I am being kicked out of the club that everybody I know is a member of. All the parents I know are allowed, as far as I knew, I was the only one that wasn't going to be allowed to go. And so I sort of resolved quickly that, if I couldn't go by that doctor's rules, I'm going to have to make my own rules and help open up commercial space so that I could go.
Right. It's incredible. It's kind of an introspective question, but what are we going to learn about ourselves, about human nature, and about people by going off-world?
Well, I think that's one of the most important and profound aspects of spaceflight, that anyone that I know who has been to orbit and had the opportunity to stare back at the Earth and kind of feel this fire hose of information about how all of the grand systems of the Earth work together, and how this human ant colony that is all over the surface, how the footprint of humanity is really everywhere that you can see from space.